Okay. Yesterday we left off talking about the text of the New Testament in our notes, page number 7, I think it was. We talked about the terms. And today, page number 8 will be the main focus. But before we do that, I'd like to address a couple other issues. I've been asked about the different Greek New Testaments, especially the different majority text New Testaments. And I'd like to give just a couple of highlights on the basis of them or the philosophy behind them, if I could. And this actually is not so easy to do because if you read the 40-page introduction to the Hodges-Farstad Greek New Testament, they don't always tell exactly what they do. Sometimes it seems like they shift a little bit, and especially in other writings that they have. So these things are not clear. I even wrote this to Pickering, for example, about 2 days ago. I got an email back yesterday on what really is the difference between his philosophy and that was used by Robinson, that was used by Hodges. And he wrote me back, and then after I read it, I said, I wonder what he's talking about. Because really, to be honest with you, it was not clear for a country boy like me. Just a couple words about the Robinson-Pierpont Greek New Testament according to the Byzantine text form. Notice even the title difference, the Byzantine text form, whereas this one says according to the majority text. And neither one of those names, Byzantine text or majority text, would originate with those people. They were in existence before that. The Robinson text, they both rely on the work of the 1913 work of von Zoden, and he collated a huge, massive amount of manuscripts. And he has a text called the Koine text or the K text and different subcategories of that. And there's also the I text, which he thought was a different category of text, but which Hodges proved that it really wasn't a different category of text, but kind of like another subcategory of the majority text. And the Hodges-Farstad text relies more on the K and the I text, whereas the Pierpont text more on the K text. And they're both just parts of von Zoden's. They both recognize that there was mistakes made by von Zoden, and like this one just says, well, these eventually need to be all examined again and corrected, etc. Now, ultimately, it seems, I know that if you had Maurice Robinson in this room right now, he would smack me for saying this, but really it seems like not just me, but other people's opinion is the Hodges-Farstad text, their goal is to get back to the original text. The Robinson-Pierpont text seems to be not to try to get back to the original text, but to the earliest form of the Byzantine text. And the Robinson-Pierpont, their goal, their thing is they say, we want a text that was actually used in history. They call it the universal text. In other words, if you pick up a United Bible Society's Greek New Testament or Nessel Allen, say 27th edition, they use they use a pretty much solid eclectic text all the way through, and I'll explain what that means in just a moment. But basically what it means is that every single textual variation, they pick and choose from anywhere the text they think fits the best. One time it might be the majority text, next time it might be the Western text, next time it might be the Alexandrian text. It could be anything, and it differs quite a bit. Hopefully, my second session today, I'm going to be talking real briefly about Mark 1:41 because it came up a little bit in this debate that we'll talk about in just a minute also. But like in the UBS text, they rate every text is rated A, B, C, D, depending on how certain they are. In the United Bible Society's third edition, they rated their reading as D, which is very uncertain. But in the fourth edition, they raised it all the way up to B, which is pretty certain. And what's significant about that is that they can go anywhere with their text. And also significant because Dan Wallace in the debate in the book that followed basically went just the opposite of the UBS committee in his decision. So the bottom line then is these two majority texts, they base their texts on the vast majority of manuscripts, but they have a little bit different philosophy. This one tends to be their goal, they say. I mean, they both follow the majority text, and in the end, the bottom of the day, there's not very much difference. This one tends to say we're trying to get back to the original text. The other one does not. Now, there's a couple more things. The Robertson-Pierpont text, they say, all the critical texts, if you use any critical text, you use a text that no human in the history of the world has ever used, before, let's say a couple hundred years. And it's true because they always used a manuscript or a text type, a text family, a group of manuscripts tended to be used. But if you make your Greek New Testament based on picking everywhere, just here, there, whatever, this seems best here, this seems best here, then what happens, you have a text that has never been used in the history of the world. And they look at that as a bad thing. And so that's their big thing, is they tend to say, okay, we want a text that's kind of like the traditional text, you might say. Okay, then that view was used even before they ever came up with it. It was called the process view. They think it's a legitimate text, but the problem is it really only tries to get the text back to maybe the 2nd century, not to the 1st century. Maybe it's enough on that one. The Harjes-Farstad text they try to go with a genuine majority. The big difference is that their philosophy was this: if every New Testament text should have, if we have enough information, a genealogical tree, a family tree. That's what the science is known as stematics, and from the word stemma, which means a family tree. And so they said, we believe the family tree theory. You take with one manuscript 2, 4, 8, 16, all that, and you keep multiplying. And so they would say, and even Hort theoretically said the same thing, is that the text with the most offspring, the most amount of manuscripts, should theoretically be the oldest text, because they all multiply, and whoever has the most children or ancestors should be the oldest. And that logically does make sense, and that's very much their philosophy here as well. So there is a difference in the text and in philosophy, but in the bottom line, at the end of the day, they really don't make a whole lot of difference, because the text you can get online and see immediately the differences in these two texts, and it's not a big difference. There's not a whole lot of difference in them. Let's see if there's any other thing. This one does have, by the way, the very valuable footnotes, whereas the Robertson text doesn't have very much in the value of that area. Okay, I'm going to skip the rest of that. Just a couple other things. There are some people who have been legitimate scholars who have been what I would call TR only. Now, in my opinion, the TR only people, the Textus Receptus only people, really don't have any solid intellectual ground to stand on. But you have to admit that there were some scholars. The one that some of you are familiar with was Jay Green, who founded that Sovereign Grace Publishers, and like 30, 40 years ago they were publishing thousands and thousands of books, really dirt cheap, and I'm sure a lot of you bought those. He published also some Greek New Testaments. They're basically the Textus Receptus, but these are people that are not King James only. In fact, he published the English Bible in several editions, including the Modern Language New Testament, the KJV 21, and some other stuff. So he was not a King James person, but he was very strongly in favor of the Textus Receptus. He didn't really give that good of arguments about it. But Ted Leadus, who unfortunately died in a car crash in 2005 in Atlanta, where he lived, he was a little bit different. He did have a PhD. I think it was from the University of Edinburgh, as I believe. But it was a very legitimate PhD. And his PhD was in basically, if you boil everything down, it was the history of the Westcott and Hort text. The history of the Greek New Testament in the 1800s, basically, in England. So he knew this stuff. And his big thing was that we need to get back to the traditional, or what he would call ecclesiastical text, the text that the church had used for years. Now, when he was on the debates from Pensacola Christian College, the videos they sent to everybody in the world, you probably got them. When he was on that, they didn't know that a couple things about him. For example, they didn't know that he talked about fundamentalists as fundamentalist, okay? They did, because he was a Lutheran. They didn't know, and probably you might know, that he did not believe in the inspiration of the original manuscripts. He did not believe in inerrancy and original inspiration. He believed that was a modern-day theory primarily invented by B.B. Warfield in the 1800s. And, of course, it wasn't, because you can go back and see even early church fathers believed that the inspiration of the original writings. Ted Leadus had a couple big theological problems, but his big thing, he did produce some very scholarly stuff trying to defend the Textus Receptus. Now, sometimes, I think in the Pensacola videos, he was pressured and put in a certain situation where, the bottom line, it looked like King James only because he rejected the New King James for no good reasons. I did know Ted Leadus, and I did talk with him a number of times by phone, but especially by emails. Actually never met him in the flesh, although we did come close a couple of times. He was a strange person. He also, this was kind of like a secret, he also was big time on the blues, jazz blues, and the Stones, like they were his number one. He was on the way back from a gig, what I understand, when he had a car crash in Atlanta and was killed. So it's really strange. These textual people are strange people to start with. Now, just a couple more terms that the majority text people, basically, they don't just count noses. Like, for example, Robinson Pierpont. Robinson is a serious advanced textual scholar, and he can hold a debate and discuss any text in the New Testament with any other text scholar on planet Earth. So he is way above my, he says earlier, way above my pay grade level. But the bottom line still is going to be, he does have presuppositions like everybody else, and he uses a form that's basically going to be based on majority text. When there's not a serious majority in his group, when there's like 70% or less, then he will use what we call internal evidence. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means later. But basically it means that not just what the manuscripts say, but what you think evidence from within, like the author's patterns or habits. Like if Paul never used this word, and it's an important word in a textual variation, you'd more likely say he probably didn't say it that way because he never said it before. Of course, the problem is that there's 3,000 words in the Greek New Testament that are only used 1, 2, or 3 times, and so, people say a lot of stuff just one time. And also what scribal habits. Some scribes obviously make certain mistakes, and that shows as well. Now, the other end of that is what we would call eclecticism, and really it's kind of a misnomer because every Greek New Testament is eclectic. That is, you always have some picking and choosing going on. I mean, the truth is there's a couple hundred times in the majority text where there is no majority text because the manuscripts are divided more than 2 ways, 3 ways, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 ways. And when there's no majority text, even a majority text advocate has to make a decision. Usually it's internal evidence of some sort or preferred. Pickering goes at it a little bit different. He takes Family 35 as the best text, and he's done more actual textual correlation work than all the other majority text people, than Wallace, than Ehrman, and all those people combined. He really has done more serious scholarly textual work than everyone that all those people I mentioned combined. So in one sense, he's the best scholar of all of them, but on the other hand, his textual philosophy has some flaws if we have a chance to get into that, and especially his idea of preservation. He doesn't really come down and face the bottom line issue that we cannot be 100% sure of the text. He will not quite say he is, but he will be so close he won't admit that he isn't. Now, the opposite end of that is like what we would call rigorous eclecticism or thoroughgoing eclecticism. Basically, what that means is that they basically say, we don't care about any Greek manuscript. We have the Greek text. We know all the possible readings. And so what we'll do is we'll look at the readings and go strictly by internal evidence to decide which is correct reading. We have all the competing readings in the Greek New Testament. We don't need anything else. And basically what they would say is the internal evidence will determine the reading in every case. That's what we call thoroughgoing, or that was made famous by G.D. Kilpatrick and one of his students, J.K. Elliott, and they did a lot of writing on that. Basically, I would say that internal evidence is more valuable when the manuscripts themselves are divided and unclear. It's an important tool, but not much. One last thing, and we'll get back to our notes. I did want to make a couple comments on a document that someone gave me. I don't have it up here now. Probably some of you have it. Is that Rose publication on the English Bibles. I don't know if anybody has one. I've seen several floating around here. I was asked about that, so let's make a couple comments. One, there is a bias. When they say what we would call literal translation, they call word-for-word translation. And no literal translation is really a word-for-word translation. They even admit that, but by using the term, you kind of like turn people against that idea. And then another biased word is, or emotional word, they use the word balanced for a text between the literal and the dynamic. And by the way they worded it, I would almost look real careful at the fine print to see if they were on the Zondervan payroll for supporting NIV, because it sounded like they would be. And then they also said, here's a question, why do New Testament new translations continue to appear? They gave 3 reasons. Word changes, understanding of ancient language improves, and translators' purposes vary. And all 3 of those are true, but sub-reasons. The real reason they never mention is because there's big money, and there's big money in translations. If you are so naive to think Zondervan put out the NIV 11 because it was trying to improve, you are seriously naive. If you go to Grand Rapids and see all the big publishers, they have these old, gigantic, super huge, old brick buildings, except Zondervan has, which has a big glass building. Why? It's a house NIV built. And they're owned by a secular publisher whose idea is making money. And that's the bottom line for all those. So that book got that wrong as well. Let's see. There's some other stuff wrong with that. I don't know if we want to get into all that stuff. Yeah, they put the Amplified Bible as a literal translation, and it's definitely not a literal translation. Let's see. He also, I think, was wrong in when he discussed the Lucianic. He called the Lucianic text type, and I don't know anyone who considered it the Lucianic recension theory an actual text type. But we need to get back to our notes at page number 8. Sorry for all those sidetracks. That was just requested information. Now, as we continue talking about the text of the New Testament, we're going to spend a few minutes on page number 8 in your notes, because page number 8, like I said, is the one-page summary of the 500-page document that I wrote. And I don't have any more of those. I only printed 11. I have to keep a couple of them. And I sold out of them yesterday. I do have a couple of books, a couple of copies of this Coming to Grips with Genesis book. If you don't have that, I can give you a copy for half price on that. But I don't have any more of those books available, the other ones. But let's take a look at this chart. And this chart, we'll talk a little bit more about the, I think we covered it a little bit, but I won't cover it, just mention a couple highlights. We did cover this yesterday, right? Or did we or did we not? Page 8. No. Okay, because I've done about 4 of these seminars already, and so I sometimes forget where I'm at. But it's part of the turf. You have to be partly absent-minded to even get up here. It's a requirement. It's a requirement from Brother Dean. Okay. Let's take a look then at page number 8. This is called New Testament Historical Chart. And this is a simplified chart. Keep in mind, you could probably say, well, it wasn't exactly like that. Yes, we know it wasn't exactly like that. That's why we have 500 other pages to explain it. Okay, at first we have the original manuscripts, let's say 45 to 95. And yes, I know there are people who believe the book of James was written as early as 35, but we're not interested in such theories today. But basically 45 to 95, the second half of the first century, the New Testament was written. Okay, now the second little box or whatever, little section there, copies and mistakes, AD 50 to 200. Copies of both originals and early copies multiplied. Most copying errors appeared by AD 200. So what would happen when Paul would send a letter to Philippi? Like I said, there was a couple hundred house churches there. They would immediately begin to make copies of the letter that they got. It would be a treasure to them. They said, wow, this is the ultimate. And they would begin spreading it right away. And every who had that original one probably would say, make copies, copies, copies. As soon as you made a copy and they'd send it next door or wherever it went, they would say, quick, make copies for other people. So they would make copies of the original. And all the time copies were being made, the original would, I'm sure, would still be multiplied as well. And that happened quite rapidly. I'm sure that in the first couple hundred years, there were tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of manuscripts copied. Now, the next thing, by the way, Scholars now, with all this information behind us and looking back at it, it's easier to see that by AD 200, approximately, give or take a little bit, we can now see that all the major textual variations that are known were known by then. So the big errors came into the first 200 years, and there's not a whole lot that wasn't known then, maybe a little bit later on some of them. And there's always, new manuscripts always have some minor things different, but the big ones are already known. Now look at the next box. Text families, AD 200 to 400. By AD 400, 4 text types had emerged: the Alexandrian text, Byzantine text, Caesarean text, Western text. Now yesterday on that map we pointed out how that those were basically geographical locations. The Alexandrian text, yes, basically comes from Alexandria, Egypt, or from Egypt. Sometimes it's even called the Egyptian text. The Caesarean text is basically from Israel. The Byzantine text from basically modern-day Turkey and Greece or Asia Minor in the old days. And the Western text from Carthage, North Africa, but mostly from Italy and Rome in the western part. So those 4 text types arose. And today the geographical names really mean nothing. And even the names weren't put in there until the 1800s, some even until the 1900s before they really stuck on well. Westcott and Hort used even different names for these. And so the names are not geographical names today. Some of these texts, some of the manuscripts that fit into different categories have been found in, they believe, in different places. Unfortunately, the manuscripts don't have dates on them, only a few do, and they don't tell where they were made, only a few of those do. But there are a few, but not very many. So by 400, these text types were in place. Now the big box there, manuscript production and loss from 200 to 1500. These are basically what we would call the Dark Ages, you might say. Before 1500, tens of thousands of New Testament manuscripts were made. Several efforts were made to destroy them. Very many extant manuscripts ended up in monasteries where they waited the Renaissance and the modern age, and the Byzantine text greatly dominated. So what happened during those next 1,000 years is that thousands, maybe millions, no one knows, were copied. I mean, they were copied and copied and copied. The Decian persecution, AD 251, a lot of manuscripts were destroyed, but the big one was the Diocletian persecution in the early 300s, 303. And what happened there is that there was a decree from Rome that the Bibles, the hymns, and all Christian literature and other religions' literature should be gathered together in every public square of every town and burned. And according to ancient historians and church fathers, there were big fires. So probably, who knows, 500,000 or hundreds of thousands. No one knows how many were burned. We do know that there were dozens that weren't burned because many of our manuscripts today, when I say many, a few dozen, predate AD 300. So those obviously manuscripts did not get found. They weren't turned over. They weren't burned. Now, also the Islamic Revolution, the 600s and especially the 700s, destroyed many biblical manuscripts as well. Now the next box is manuscript rediscovery 1500 to 2012. In this era, some 6,000 manuscripts were discovered, studied, cataloged, etc. The Alexandrian Byzantine texts were prominent. The characteristic results of the two families do differ. And the bottom line today is that most scholars say, okay, there really is no such thing as a Western text and Caesarean text. Yes, it exists. Yes, it's valuable, but it's so sparsely supported that we might as well say it doesn't exist. And that's basically the view of Holland and Holland. But here are the characteristics of the Alexandrian text and the Byzantine text, the left and the right. And that really was where kind of like a debate is today. There was a big debate over this stuff in the 70s, 80s. It seemed like it kind of died out in the 90s. But now it seems like it's coming back again. And that there's this debate even among the big-time scholars are fighting over this again. But you can see the characteristics. On the left-hand side, the Alexandrian text. The right-hand side, the Byzantine text. The Alexandrian minority number, about 2%. And really, as far as I can tell, to be honest with you, it's only maybe less than 1%, but we put 2. Majority text, about 90%. And the people who count such things say everywhere from 80 to 95. And the best efforts seem to be about 90. There are some shorter readings, some longer readings. Sometimes it has to do with just points of grammar, just even has to do with adding words, small amounts, little amounts here and there. textual issues, sometimes half a verse. The easy one to remember are the big ones like Romans 8:1. It's not really a main issue they're talking about here, but that's the idea, is that the Alexandrian text there's no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. The Byzantine text also has, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. And people, both sides would agree that there's no Christian doctrine that depends only on what's found in a textual variation. For example, in that verse, in that particular thing, in verse 4, every manuscript, as far as I know, has the same thing, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. There's also, the Alexandrian manuscripts tend to be older, and the Byzantine manuscripts tend to be later. The Alexandrian are less consistent with themselves, and the Byzantine texts are more consistent. And right away, I should say, and we'll talk about this on the next page, the strongest point of the Alexandria text is that they are older manuscripts. The weakest point is that they are not quality manuscripts. They are against themselves. And so when you read in your Bible, the oldest and best manuscripts omit this verse. What they really mean is some of the oldest and the worst manuscripts. And the reason I say worst is not because I don't like them. I think they're very valuable, but the two leading manuscripts of that group, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, disagree 38 times per chapter in the four Gospels. And that's average. And so when the two leading ones disagree, then that's their weaker point. Whereas the Byzantine text, the strongest argument in favor of that is not just numbers, although that, when you talk 90%, that is big-time numbers. But the strongest favor that seems to be coming out now in favor of the Byzantine or majority text is that it is very consistent, and yet there's enough divergent all over to prove that it didn't come from just one source or one area. It was widely distributed. It's consistent enough to say it is one family, one text type, but it's not consistent enough to say that it's everybody just copied from each other. They had to have a text older than the text itself. And then the New Testaments that came from that, these are the most famous ones then there are a lot more of these, of course. From the Alexandrian text, you have Lockman, Tischendorf's 8th edition, which is still used to some degree, Westcott and Hort, and then the common ones today, Nessa-Allen 27, UBS 4. On the right-hand side, you have all the earlier Greek New Testaments, Erasmus, Stephen, Beza, Elzevir's produced the Textus Receptus, and the only new one would be the majority text. And really those Greek New Testaments on the right side, the first four, the Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza, and Elzevir, those really are not majority text Greek New Testaments. They're only Textus Receptus, but there's no other category. And I'd really have to mess up this chart. I kind of like the way it looks now, like a robot. See the big legs there? And if I put a thing there, it looked like he had a big knot on his knees coming out of that side, and I don't like that. But basically, it's the majority text. This right here came out in 1982. And it's interesting that in all the history of this world, it was not until 1982 that any human being had a Greek New Testament that was based on the majority of New Testament manuscripts. And that's interesting because it's just in our lifetime. Then the English Bibles that came from those are down below, and these are strictly based on sales. Which one sold the most, not the favorite one or anything like that. On the left, you have the English Revised Version, American Standard, Goodspeed Revised, New American Standard, the Good News or today's English Version, Living Bible, and New International Version. And on the right side, you have all the earlier English Bibles, Tyndale, Coverdale, Great Geneva, Bishops, King James, and then the only new one would be the 1979 New Testament, New King James. Now, if you can think through that page, you are well on your way to putting yourself to sleep. No, I mean, you're well on your way to. You will know more than 95% of all Christians in the United States and in the world concerning this issue. I can promise you that. Just a simple little page right here. But I do need to pause and say, are there any questions on anything that we've said so far? You have a question? Oh, I thought you had one. Okay. He was going like this, but I thought he'd be like this. Yes?
This is the New King James based on the TR and not tied as far as that majority text.
Yes. In fact, I should have made a note on that. Every Bible on the right side of this bottom one, every one is based on the TR, not on the majority text. Actually, when the New King James came out, not only did they call it the 5th edition of the King James, But they also, and it really was the 5th edition because it was revised in 1600s and 1700s 4 times. But they also called it, they wanted to make it based on the majority text because Thomas Nelson that same year was coming out with the majority text, or just after this. But they wisely decided not to, because if they had, they wouldn't have had the sales that they got now, because no one knew that text. It had never been published in the history of the world. They'd say, what's this new text? Now, for quality purposes, it would have been 10 times better if they would base it on the majority text. In fact, we should probably, Dan Ingram and I should probably get together this afternoon and put out the New King James according to the majority text and get Thomas Nelson to sell it, and then we'd be rich and famous tomorrow. Well, he is already, but I'm just a poor missionary.
For no good reason,
though. Yeah. Okay, but that's a good question, and it's correct.
ESV is not on here. How would you classify that?
It would just be it's an Alexandrian text. It would be just right under NIV. If I need to, I probably should update this now. The big sellers today are ESV, Holman Christian, New American Standard, and New King James. The last I checked, and it was about a year ago, they each had about 3, 4, 5% of the market. NIV still had the big bulk of the market, and King James had the second big bulk. So the NIV and the King James are still the biggest selling Bibles, although now you have to get NIV 11. So I'm not sure what that means. And one other question. I saw this man right here.
No, it was the same question.
Oh. Yes. Yeah, the problem, one reason I don't like the ESV is because the quality of the translation seems to be good, but it's hard to buy it without the notes today, and the notes are based on 7-point Calvinism from John Piper. So, okay. If there any other questions? Those are good questions. Yes.
Can I just ask what your impression is of the Holman?
Actually, I think it's probably, as far as overall accuracy and usability and stuff, I think it's probably one of the best ever made in the history of the world. I really do think it's, in fact, I would even say I might even be willing to say, if I was paid by them, that it is the very best. But I haven't read the whole thing through. I've only read it enough to review it. And I have published a review of some of these English Bibles. But I think it's a very good quality. I think the New King James and the Holman are very, very good quality Bibles. NASB is a very good quality Bible. Some people think it's a little bit too literal for them, but it's not extreme. Holman is based on the, and that debate also has had at every one of these versions, is based on the Alexandrian text. It's not quite as literal as the other ones, is the New King James or NASB, and so it's still considered a good quality literal translation, but it's has enough of the dynamic to make it easier to read. And some of those things actually do help. So it's one of those issues. And I wasn't paid anything for that. I should have been. Okay. Now, on page number 9, we talk about strengths and weaknesses of the Alexandrian and the majority text. I've already been asked some questions from people that read this ahead of time. I'll try to cover those here. Now, these are basically my opinions. I got a lot of them from others. Some of them I invented myself. Later this year, they're supposed to come out. And if it does come out, you should definitely cover this in next year's symposium. Is this a symposium or is this conference? Conference. Symposium, what that means is from 2 Greek words, which means to drink together. Sum, with, and the other word just means to drink a glass of water or whatever. Any drink. Sit around and drink and talk textual issues. I can tell from right over here we got some votes for that. Okay. Yeah, that's the Baptist crowd right there. Oh, man, I'll tell you. Okay. Now, not everyone would agree with this, and these are not all my thoughts, but I take responsibility. But I was going to say, and I never got to it. Later this year, they're supposed to be coming out, and when they say later this year, they really mean next year. I mean, it's publishers lie big time, but they promise this year. The world's first, what I would consider really scholarly defense book that's full-length, scholarly, very scholarly defense of the Byzantine text. And whether it will make it or not, I don't know. I don't have a hand in it. I offered, but they said, don't call us, we'll call you. They said, are you going to Chafer conference? I said, yes, don't call us. Okay. Anyway. And also Maurice Robinson at the end of this year, by the end of this year, is supposed to be published everything he's ever published, written, whatever. I mean, not every book, but basically everything is supposed to be compiled into one volume as well. And he really is I think, the world's greatest thinker and speaker, publisher, whatever, in defense of the majority text. Now, there's other people that probably could do better than him that write small stuff here and there. And like in our class that we're teaching on textual criticism at the seminary this week, last week and this week, the students have to subscribe to a textual criticism discussion list. And on that list, there are some majority text advocates that are serious scholars. But I think Maurice Robinson has published more like in the ETS meetings and that sort of stuff than anyone else. So his book, everything he's written will be coming out this year, maybe. And then this other book, which really should be, it would be the same as page 8, only 400 pages, or page 9, I mean. Okay, let's talk about Alexandrian text. It is early, having manuscripts that date to AD 200. Number 2, it gives evidence of text families that existed in 200. And that was because of combination of manuscript Sinaiticus and, manuscript Vaticanus B and papyrus number 75, which is dated AD about 200, and it's of Luke and John. Because of those two are so close, that gave the Alexandrian text a very strong footing that dates to about AD 200. So it's established as a text type that early. It is the main text chosen by modern translations. Maybe we should put that as a weakness. I don't know. It was used by some. It was a text used by some early church fathers. There are actually quite a few quotations which seem to favor that text. And number 5, among unsealed manuscripts that are dated AD 500 or earlier, it outnumbers the Byzantine text 4-2. Those are unsealed manuscripts that have at least 10 pages, that's a number that scholars say is significant. And it outnumbers the Byzantine text by AD 500. It outnumbers those 4-2. There are weaknesses. Number 1, the most important Alexandrian text manuscripts disagree many times. For example, Aleph, Sinaiticus, and B. Vaticanus disagree more than 3,000 times in the Gospels. And really, that's where the biggest disagreements are. Or, like I said, 38 times per chapter. So no matter what you say, you cannot say that they're quality manuscripts. And since manuscript Papyrus 75 agrees with B, then that is looked at as the best, and also it's earlier, probably dated earlier, about 40 years. That's looked at as really almost the definition of the Alexandrian text, or those two manuscripts. Whereas now Sinaiticus is looked at as not favorably, even though it is the oldest Bible in the world. It has much more textual variation, has a lot of correctors, and in fact, 50% of all the variants list that are in manuscript Sinaiticus can be called Byzantine readings as well. It's just that almost all textual critics that have written have been Alexandrian advocates, so when there's a variation, they say it's an Alexandrian reading. But half of those could be, approximately 50%, could be called Byzantine text reading against the third reading. Okay, so number 2, scholars have now recognized that too much weight was given to this text. That is, for example, 3 texts over 2,000 texts in Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 20. So in the last 12 verses of Mark, there are they're actually not quite 2,000 manuscripts of this passage. There are more than 2,000 manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, but not all of them have the ending. Almost all of them do. It's really 1,800, 1,900, somewhere around there. But of all those ancient Greek manuscripts, there's only 3 known in the whole world that don't have this text, the ending of Mark. Now, the ones that do have it, yes, the 2000 or whatever that do have, there are variations. There's the long ending and the shorter ending. In fact, there's a number of manuscripts they didn't know what to do, so they put both the long ending and the shorter ending. And so there is a lot of debate over that. I personally believe that with that much textual evidence, no matter what the internal evidence is, that it has to be a genuine part of Scripture. Whereas Dan Wallace just says it's immediately that it's not part, that it is not a part of a genuine Scripture. But when you're talking 3 to 2,000, it's not like we're talking 10%. We're talking, like more than 99 or some weird percent like that. And let's see what's next. Yes, number 3. It was popularized by the Westcott and Hort, but all 5 pillars of their textual theory are now disproved. The Westcott and Hort theory was really based on 5 theories, 5 textual ideas. It was stated very strongly by Hort in 1881 in their Prolegomena. So powerful was it that every scholar was bowed down by it and pretty well had to accept it. There were some that rejected it from the very beginning, but not many. But really the bottom line today is that the text is still looked at as important, as the best text overall because it's of its age and a few other things. But even though they say, yes, Westcott and Hort were wrong, in fact, in your Nestle-Aland 27th edition in the introduction, it even says the age of Westcott and Hort and Tischendorf is over, is definitely over. So they've been totally rejected, but their text is basically the same. I mean, it's like 99% the same as the one that's used today. Now, it is true, like even the NIV, sometimes we'll use the majority text, not the Alexandrian text, because it's based strictly on a eclectic system. They did start with the Nestle-Aland text, like the NASB started with Nestle-Aland 22, NIV, whatever was 25 or whatever was coming out at that time. But they oftentimes did deviate. I've heard 500 times, I've never bothered to research where they were or what they were. Okay, let's see. Now, number 4. The Alexandrian text has only 2%, maybe 1% of the manuscripts, which is extremely low. Number 5, it has conflations, harmonizations, and liturgical changes. And that's not really serious, but there are some in that text as well as all other texts. And there's possible biblical problems. You can see some. I'm not going to take time to read through these. There are some factual problems in that text. It could be just a small scribal error. It's not a really big deal. The big things and the weaknesses are the disagreements and extreme loyalty to it, to take a reading of 3 over 3,000, and plus there's other evidence besides Greek manuscripts for that text. Now, there are also strengths and weaknesses of the majority text. One, the numerical superiority having 90% of all manuscripts. That's becoming more and more important when it's realized that these manuscripts were from all over they come from all over the Mediterranean, not just the Byzantine Empire, though the vast majority of them did come from there. Number 2, the manuscripts disagree with each other less. They do disagree with each other enough to prove that they're not all just a copy of each other. They came from some source older than themselves. 3, the majority text readings in the papyri are just as old as those in the Alexandrian text. That was basically the word of Sturz when his doctoral dissertation was put into a book. Basically what he did was show that early Byzantine readings are found in the papyri manuscripts dated about AD 200. Now, when we say the word readings, we don't say the word text type. They were representatives from the text type, but not enough length of them to call that the Byzantine text family. So an Alexandrian text advocate would say, well, they're not found, they're just readings from the text type. But if you have readings that are clearly from the Byzantine text type in those manuscripts, it proves that those readings had to be known, the text had to be known, had to be in existence at the time, even though there's no manuscript of it at that time. 4, it has wide geographical distribution around the Mediterranean Sea. 5, the best Alexandrian manuscripts contain many majority text readings. Sinaiticus is approximately 50% majority text. 6, its existence cannot be explained and must be admitted to the 300s. And that's really one of the strongest arguments, because no one has ever come up with a theory of how a theory that makes any sense to me and most other people, of how the Byzantine text came into existence. I mean, some will say, yeah, the Western text and the Alexandrian text or whatever mixed and made this text. but it really doesn't fit all the data. Number 7, among unsealed manuscripts that are dated to 600, remember the other one we used for the Alexandrian was to 500, but if we go to 600 or earlier, it outnumbers the Alexandrian text 2 to 1. Logically, the older text should produce the most offspring, and even Hort admitted that. The Byzantine text is from locations where Greek language was spoken. Doesn't really prove anything, but it's another evidence. If Greek was continually spoken where they made these manuscripts, those people should know a little bit more about what they were doing. Many other manuscripts are obviously copied by people who did not know Greek, and the mistakes show that. Number 9, the Byzantine text is from locations where Greek. Number 10, is primarily from locations where the New Testament letters were sent. Now, you can imagine if Houston, Texas was one of the places where Paul sent one of his letters. Oh, what's that noise out there? Oh, the guy making manuscripts out there. Making lunch, he says. Until we're on a budget cut this year. Okay. Well, if a letter was sent here, you would certainly, the churches in existence for the first few hundred years that got those letters would treasure those and guard those with their life. I mean, that would be like the absolute most important thing that church had, period. And so you would think that the preservation would be they would think, it's just a piece of junk Paul sent, who cares what it says. It'd be very important to them. Number 11, the majority text was a choice of scribes for 1,200 years. The majority text brought order out of chaos. The early papyri appear very confused and diverse, perhaps because of persecution. Majority text tended to correct that text. And that's a big argument also that Robinson makes, is that there's evidence that the Byzantine text is actually a correction of what was there before. And as it began to correct it, and then when Christianity became legal, it wasn't long till the text was pretty much agreed that it was corrected. And sure enough, it wasn't long after that, 100, 200 years after that, almost all manuscripts copied were of the majority text type. And number 13, most criticize the Byzantine text because they don't like it. I mean, it's amazing how it's just basic prejudice. I mean, people come with presuppositions, and that's even when a reading could be either way. It will always be they will say it's Alexandrian text. They won't say it's majority text. Now, there are weaknesses. It's weak in the church fathers that date before AD 350. This argument has been disputed by some people because the problem is which critical edition of the church fathers do you use, because they are different. And I think the bottom line is a lot more work needs to be done in that area, but that seems to be a legitimate argument. Number 2, the oldest Byzantine manuscripts date to the 4th, or maybe 4th or 5th. We say 5th. It could be called manuscript W. It could be called the 4th century. In Paul's epistles, it is to the 8th century. Number 3, most majority text manuscripts were made after AD 1000. Number 4, it's sometimes divided, leaving no majority. And in fact, a couple hundred times, there is no such thing as a majority text if you go by numbers. And number 5 has conflations, harmonizations, liturgical changes. Not really very much, just like the Alexandria text doesn't have much. Possible biblical problems, none noted. Okay, that's basically what I would look at is the strengths and weakness of each. When I was in college, after I'd had 2 years of Greek, I took, they taught us basic textual criticism, and the professor was a very strong Alexandrian text advocate. But at that time, I also read early articles in BibSac by Zane Hodges. In my whole life, I never met the man, but his arguments at that time seemed to make sense to me. And so, over the next 30 years, I would consider that I gradually and consistently became what I would call a majority text advocate. I do not take it to the level of some people. It's not my religion. If the majority text reading doesn't seem to be the best reading, I don't have any problem going with what I would consider the best reading, because sometimes it's not easy. But overall, I would consider myself a majority text advocate. There are just too many problems, in my opinion, with the Alexandrian text. I don't go with the conspiracy theories and all that stuff that the King James only people come up with. Unfortunately, they've done more damage to the cause than they have done good in many ways. Okay, any questions or comments? Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit on what standard was used for correcting the making that correction, point number 12, majority text strength.
Yes, well, if you look at the papyri manuscript... Okay, he asked a question about point number 12, which is the majority text brought order out of chaos, that early papyri were confused. Pretty much everyone, Dan Wallace and everybody pretty much admit, in fact, one of his weaknesses that Bart Ehrman in this debate pointed out was the weakness of these papyri manuscripts that date about AD 200. And one of the criticisms of Dan Wallace of that debate is he did not really answer about manuscript P66. There were some weaknesses that he did not address. And the differences in the manuscripts, the early papyri manuscripts really aren't that great a quality. There's basically the Bodmer and the Chester Beatty papyri. They only have like 124 verses in common, and they have more differences in those two groups of manuscripts than they have verses. And so what the theory is that because of persecution, incommunication, they're what we call wild readings or wild manuscripts. They were written with lots of mistakes in them, kind of like manuscript D. Where that came from, I'm not sure, but it's lots of mistakes in that. And so, but later on, the text became more consistent, and it looks like what they did when they had opportunities and freedom, communication, and you wouldn't be killed for being a Christian or whatever. Then they began to put the text back together, and when they did that, then the Byzantine text by far dominated everything else. The people who look at manuscript Vaticanus and B, which I say is basically the definition of Alexandria Text, those two texts they don't believe that B ever looked at the writer of that copier ever looked at manuscript P75, but they both came from, they think, an earlier one, maybe just before AD 200 or something. So those two aren't copies of each other. So, in other words, B was not an effort to try to correct the text, but a copy of some exemplar. And that's basically the idea. Everyone agrees that the papyri manuscripts have big problems. What happened after that is a disagreement. One theory, the majority text theory, like Robinson's, he discusses it in more detail. He will show how that it seems to have brought what I would say order out of chaos.
We need microphone, Eddie.
Dr. Minton, Dr. Black came to Shepherd's a while back and expounded on his theory of how the last verses of Mark actually got there. Have you heard that theory and interacted with it at all? And he's a Markan prioritist, so it's very interesting to...
I don't know if I've actually read his theory on that or not. I might not have. But I've read tons of stuff on it, and it would be interesting to see. We probably don't have time to tell about the theory now, but it would be interesting to see how. I know that some of the people who are writing the book on the text of, in defense of the Byzantine text, at least one of the persons on that is definitely one of the world's leading experts on that passage. I mean, the guy he's got a couple thousand pages of just research notes just on that textual variation, way more than Burgon ever even put together. So I don't really know the details of that, but it would be interesting to see how they interact with it.
Okay.
So are you Matthew or Mark priority?
I would tend, if I had to pick one, I would tend to think that Matthew was priority. I wouldn't go with Ehrman and Wallace, who think that Mark is, and most other people. There's some good articles. I think the best articles written on that were by Dr. Thomas at Master Seminary. He put out some good articles in their journal on the priority theories, and I think he did better justice than most of the other people, and basically said, first of all, we don't know if there's any priority, which is basically my view. There's too many inconsistencies to say that this always relied on that one, because there's way a lot of inconsistencies. And I really don't think that there's any that strong evidence that Mark came first anyway.
Russ just corrected what he said earlier, that that's David Allen Black, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Black's Matthew priority. He said Mark earlier, and I just wanted to correct that.
Yeah,
Matthew priority. And these are important things. I think there's a book out that Thomas and David Farnell wrote came out in about 1998 or so, called The Jesus Crisis. And Farnell had just gotten his PhD from Dallas Seminary in New Testament Studies, and basically, rips the whole New Testament department at Dallas Seminary because of the way they handle textual problems and apparent conflicts in the synoptics. Matthew says Jesus did something. For example, the Sermon on the Mount. Luke says it's a Sermon on the Plain. And some people will say, see, well, and in fact, even in that book...
Rethinking?
Rethinking, what's it?
Rethinking New Testament Textual Criticism.
Rethinking New Testament Textual Criticism that Dan Wallace just came out with. In a footnote on about the fourth or fifth page, he says, the writers of the Gospels are in general agreement. And I just highlighted that and went, general agreement?
Yeah.
To me, that doesn't reflect a as profound a view of the text as I have.
Actually, that book was Rethinking the Corruption.
Oh, yeah, Rethinking the Corruption of the New Testament Text. It just came out with. So there are a lot of issues here. And then there was another book on the origins of the gospel that Thomas was the editor in Farnell, and John Niemela wrote a section in there. Niemela's doctoral dissertation, which, where's Perkins? Is he here? Mark's read parts of it, but it's like half of it, it's about 800 pages, and half of it is in-depth statistics that's way beyond my pay grade. And but he argues, he pretty much puts a wooden stake through the heart of the whole idea of a Q, existence of a Q gospel as a predecessor and Markan priority. And even Farmer, who was one of the at SMU, who was one of the real, big proponents in the whole gospel argument here, said that John's arguments basically decimated everybody else. But you got to read it first, get a hold of a copy, and then you got to be able to understand what John says. So, anyway, question over here, Robert.
Okay. When I was in Biola many years ago, the Bible that they had us buy was a Berkeley Bible. What is it based on, and can you comment on it?
Actually, I do have a copy of that, but I don't know a whole lot about it because it wasn't a serious contender for sales and such. But it's based on, I think, and the reason I say that is because I really would be shocked at anything else. I think it would just be an Alexandrian Text Bible for the New Testament. I don't really know their translation philosophy or much behind it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Why is the ending on Mark 16 cut off so widely accepted? I mean, what you said about the manuscript evidence, that's pretty overwhelming, but it's generally dissed by all modern translations. And what's the publisher of the modern scholarly defense of majority text that you were talking about?
What was the last question, publisher?
You mentioned that later this year there would be an up-to-date scholarly edition.
I think, to be honest with you, I think they're keeping that, because I asked on the textual criticism list about that, and I think the people they told me some people are writing chapters of it. I don't really know them. I've seen a lot of their comments over the years of textual criticism lists, and they're better scholars in that area, even more advanced than I am, thank the Lord. But I don't know that there's a publisher. I think it's going to be kind of like they don't want to have it critiqued too hard before it comes out. That's the problem in one of these things, is that when you put out a scholarly book, people blast it before it even hits the market. So that's why you should get this book, Coming to Grips with Genesis, because in 4 years, not one scholarly critique has come out seriously against it, because so far they haven't been able to. Now, I did want to, I don't know how much time I think. I only have 45 minutes left.
You got 10 minutes.
You can tell he's a redaction critic. Okay. I want to cover, I said I was going to do this, and I haven't done that yet. I want to cover real quickly the debate that Dan Wallace had with Bart Ehrman on October 1st, 2011 at SMU. And I didn't go there. There were almost 1,600 people that went to that. I don't know what they charged, but they paid. It was sponsored by Dan Wallace's Center for New Testament Manuscripts, and also that book that you talked about. I think I still have that copy of your book over there. the book that Dan Wallace put out against Bart Ehrman, saying basically it was reconsidering the corruption of the New Testament. That book was released that night, so he probably sold 1,600 copies that night of it. But yeah, their manuscript, their big deal is finding new manuscripts of the New Testament and publishing them, putting them online. And to his credit, I think Dan Wallace has found more, and his group has found more New Testament manuscripts that have not been published, cataloged, known before than any human being alive. I think he really has. About 75 or so, as far as I understand. I mean, a lot of them. So he really has done a service. He really, really has. Anyway, let me just give a quick summary of what I saw in it and what I read about it and the whole thing. First, Ehrman's point, he had three things that he basically said. He said for him, the main issue was that 100 to 150 year period after the New Testament was written till we have any serious manuscripts, that there's a block period which we have almost no information. Since we don't know what happened there, we cannot say in honesty that the text was preserved through that period. In other words, when they begin around AD 200, we begin to pick up serious manuscripts again. Well, what about the previous 100 years, 150 years? Where did they write from, copy from? What did they copy from? How do we know that that was worth anything? We don't know. Okay, the second thing was the earlier scribes in that same period were probably the worst scribes of all because they weren't trained. The Christians weren't trained yet. They weren't professional scribes. And as time went by, they became better and better and better. By the Middle Ages, the Byzantine text scribes were professional scribes. That's why you have manuscripts. And even the early Alexandrian texts, like Manuscript Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, they're obviously done by professional scribes. And so the text begins to look better and better. But he said the big thing was the earlier manuscripts were written by bad scribes. And the third thing he said was that the phrase, his other big point was that the phrase original text is no longer used by the real textual scholars of the world. And it's true that they no longer seek to get the original text. Now what they seek to do is get the, what we would call maybe an exemplar text, the text that was behind the oldest manuscripts that we have, but not the original text. That's pretty much out the door as far as their terms that are used. Dan Wallace's main points were these. He said, actually, if you look at your notes on page 4, that's his main point was page 4 of this note that we gave you. He says that comparing the New Testament with other ancient literary documents, the New Testament was very reliable, extreme, and he showed several statistics. He had some information that I do not have in there, which I'm going to try to get that information. And that was a big thing for him, to prove the text of the New Testament is reliable, especially if you compare it with any other ancient literary documents in Greek and Latin of the similar time period. And it is. I mean, you look at that chart and you say it's not even a close comparison. And by the way, Ehrman did not disagree. He agreed 100% with that. He said, yes, that's true. But it makes no difference because we're not interested in that. And when he would counteract, when Wallace would counteract, well, if we go by your skepticism, then no one would know what these ancient historians and politicians wrote. And he said, you're right, we don't know, and no one cares. His second thing was that, basically I've led into that, his second thing was that Ehrman was way too skeptical in the light of the evidence. In other words, we have so many New Testament manuscripts, and a lot of them are early, and they're so far superior in quality and numbers and in proximity and the whole thing to other ancient literary documents, that if we were that skeptical about other stuff, we would know nothing. I mean, he goes way beyond the skeptic level that he should. Just for even being taken the other side of the debate, he shouldn't be that skeptical where he said we could know basically nothing for sure. He also said that Ehrman's books, and even his recent book that came out just last year, 2011, indicate that Ehrman does know the original text. They presuppose this book's, and you can listen to the debate and get the details, but basically what he did say, and I think it was a good point, that Ehrman says a lot of stuff that we don't know the original text, and the only way he can know that is if he knows it to show that we don't know it. In other words, if you're going to argue that we don't know it, you have to say, well, what do we don't know? And he says, well, this is not like the original text. Well, how do you know? He's presupposing that he knows what the original text was. And then he made one other let's see, one other major point was this, that, he also got into sales. He said his brand new book, Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament, was out that day. And I had not read the book myself. Brother Dean gave me a copy of it, and I read it the other night and slept good after that. But, it's a very, it's basically answering some of the key points in some of Ehrman's writings. And some of it is not directly related, but just closely like a whole big chapter on John 1:1 and that kind of stuff. A couple things in my analysis. Ehrman and the KJVOs are at the extremes as to the point of certainty. Dan Wallace kind of hinted at this a couple times about him as well. No, with the KJVO movement, they have to have absolute 100% perfect certainty for their faith. Whereas Ehrman seems like he has to go to the point to say we have to have absolute 100% certainty that we don't know what the text said. And I'm serious. That's basically what he says. I felt that Wallace was too soft, or what some people call moderate, on the certainty of the text, even though he's conservative in theology. Whereas Ehrman was like zero certainty on the text, maybe below zero. In other words, we know it didn't say what we think it said. Whereas Wallace would not go so far as he would talk about the integrity of it and how certain we can be, but really he's willing to bend a little bit too far and take a more moderate view. And I think what happens when you do that, you win a lot more people to your side that would listen and say, who won this debate? Well, because then you're going to have the right, and then the other people, aren't sure they're going to vote with you as well. And that may be the case. I don't really know for sure. The bottom line is that both of them basically presented their presuppositions. Ehrman admitted he's not a believer. He said in the debate, the biggest disappointment of everything is my grandpa, who was a strong Baptist believer, would be disappointed he said his biggest disappointment would be in me. That's what he said. So he doesn't claim to be like, this great Christian and all that stuff. And his people's presuppositions come through. Both of them came through loud and clear. Ehrman was weak textually. He is a scholar, but the stuff that he said, he seemed to be trying to destroy or weaken the faith of the average person in the pew who doesn't really know the textual issues. Maybe they're a new believer or a Baptist believer, which means that they don't really know much. I know because I are one. But basically it seems like those people who say, yes, bless God, we believe the Bible, we're going to go preach it around the world, we're going to go to these Bible studies and all this stuff. When you confront them with this information, it looks like they don't have any basis for their text. A lot of those people are going to say, whoa. And that's what they hear on TV, that's what they hear in the Da Vinci Code. They hear everybody picks up on what Ehrman says. Everybody. He's been on all the TV shows and all this stuff. And so it almost seems like his goal is to destroy faith. And he's able to do that by saying that we have zero certainty in it. Whether maybe it's his goal, whatever, because he is a scholar, but why he doesn't write scholarly books? The only scholarly book that he really wrote that I'm aware of that was worth anything was just revising Bruce Metzger's book, and he made it worse instead of better. So, okay, I think I'm basically out of my time. I have 20 more minutes to go, but he's not going to let me. Any other last questions?
I got a couple of comments too on the debate. I'd encourage you, if you're a pastor or you teach, to watch this debate. You can order it online, watch it, analyze it. What I think you'll see is 5, 6, 7. I can't remember now. I need to go back and go through this again. But there's 5, 6, or 7 points that Ehrman makes over and over again. The guy's a master communicator. He understands the principle. The first 3 laws of communication are repetition, repetition, and repetition. And he hits these points over and over again. And like Ron just pointed out, my impression was that Ehrman is the kind of guy who's going to look at a glass that's halfway filled with water, and he's going to say it's half empty and it's almost gone. He comes very skeptical. He's very negative, and he really is. I think he's out to destroy people's faith, confidence in the Scripture. He was raised an evangelical, but he's completely rejected. In fact, there were 3 or 4 points that Dan brought out against him from early statements that he had made, in earlier writings back in the 90s, and he said, "Well, I just don't believe that anymore. I don't believe in Christianity, and I'm not a practicing Christian." So he's clearly coming from a negative, anti-Christian, skeptical viewpoint. But these 6 points that it reiterates over and over and over again are comments that you're going to hear, and people in your congregations are going to hear anytime they try to witness to anybody in our postmodern culture. I mean, I've heard almost all of those 5 or 6 times in just having casual conversations with unbelievers. Well, you don't even know when what the New Testament said, because it was written 200 years after Jesus lived, or we don't have any of those manuscripts, so how can you trust it? We don't have the original, so how do you know that's what it says? It's all been correct. All these things come out, and what we need to craft is short, pithy, 2-sentence responses to these criticisms, because when you're sitting across a coffee table for somebody in a restaurant or something, and they come out with this kind of a statement, we need to be able to answer it like that on the spot with a quick rejoinder, because you're not going to have time to sit down and say, well, let me read a 60-page master's thesis to you on this particular issue. So I think this is extremely important stuff, because it challenges the very root of our faith, in that it's textually based. Ray, you have a question? Okay, you're just stretching back there.
Yeah,
all right.
His real big thing is we don't know. He kept saying, we don't know. And it's true. There is a degree of truth in that, because we don't have, And he was asked, by the way, someone in the question and answer time, someone says, well, what would it take for you to know? What evidence would it be? And he said, well, if there was a certain number of manuscripts that we could prove they're dated 1 week after it was originally written. He said, that would be pretty good evidence. Well, for one thing, we don't know. If we had an original manuscript with us today, we wouldn't know that either. How are we going to know? We don't know.
Okay, so Charlie was just asking me about the where you can order it. You can get it from the, I was looking for Dan's, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. That's Dan Wallace's organization.
Or by Kriegel. Just get on Kriegel.
No, ordering the debate.
Oh, okay.
You can go to the just Google Wallace Ehrman debate.
Yeah, you'll get it.
Okay, and you'll get it. Just Google that, and it'll come up in one of the first two or three hits. Seemed like there was something else I was going to add, but anyway, we need to go ahead and break. George will hopefully be here for the second session.
If he's not here, why don't I just continue?
Yeah, that's right. If he doesn't show up, we may move you up and put him in the afternoon. George apparently picked up a little stomach virus last night, so he wasn't here last night, and he's doing well this morning, but he just wasn't going to come in until he spoke, and so everybody give him a hard time about eating that macrobiotic stuff that he does. That's probably what made him sick. It's that health food. It's not healthy.
Oh, wait, we have it.
Okay, yeah.
Fat Bill.
Okay, yeah. In other words, go back there and make yourself fat. I've got some folks in the church who love to cook, and they really overdid it, and they're just great. Also, one announcement Connie made is there's a business down here on this end of the building. We've got Aunt Pookie's over here to the south, and we've got another business here on the north, and some folks parked around there, and it's blocking some of their customer base as well. So if you're parked down around this end of the building, this north end of the building, if you could move your car back over to this back side, and there's even behind this building, across the parking lot, there's another parking lot, and I think there's some vacancies back there, so that'll be a little bit better place to park. So if you could do that to help out our neighbors, we'd all appreciate it, okay? All right, we'll be back here in 20 minutes.